Welcome everyone to this presentation of the 2020 and 2021 Performance Progress Report data. I would like to thank all the grantees for submitting their PPRs despite the challenges the COVID-19 pandemic has had on us all. As we can see here, despite the COVID-19 pandemic beginning in fiscal year 2020, the number of survivors that were assisted was similar to pre-pandemic levels, to the order of 95% for 2020 and 2021. As usual, women were the majority of survivors assisted in 2020 and 2021, 70 and 72%, respectively. Children were the second largest population assisted, 20% and 18% for 2020 and 2021. Men were assisted at 7% and 8% of 2020 and 2021 totals, and not specified was assisted at 3 and 2% of 2020 and 2021 totals. With regards to shelter versus non-shelter survivors, for state grantees, there was a decrease from the pre-pandemic percentage of 20% of those being served as shelter clients. It decreased to 17% in 2020. However, it returned to 20% in 2021. The disruption was greater for tribal grantees. In 2020, shelter clients increased 23% from 2019 levels, but it fell by 30% in 2021 from the 2020 amount. Non-shelter clients had a less than 1% increase from 2019 to 2020, but fell by 26% from 2020 to 2021. Average shelter nights in 2020 and 2021 were 38 and 32, not a large change from the 36 that was reported in 2019. Unmet requests for shelter overall saw a decline. However, for tribal grantees, unmet requests for shelter rose sharply in 2020 and 2021, increasing by 17% and then by 82%. Crisis hotline calls to state grantees decreased in 2020, but recovered to pre-pandemic levels in 2021. For tribal grantees, crisis hotline calls saw a sharp decline in 2020 and 2021. The majority of clients assisted by state grantees were between the ages of 25 to 59, 60%. The second largest cohort was children aged infant to 12, 16%. 48% of tribal clients were between the ages of 25 to 59. 24% of clients were children aged infant to 12. With regards to race and ethnicity for state grantees, white people were the largest cohort assisted at 39%. Followed by Hispanic people at 20% and African American people at 19%. Tribal grantees served a much different population, with American Indian Alaskan Natives being the largest cohort that was assisted at 57%, followed by white people at 19%. Clients requiring language services continued to grow in 2020, with 2021 having a slight decline in clients needing language services, but it was still a larger amount of requests than the 2019 amount. Services provided to survivors had differing usage patterns depending on if the survivor was an adult or child. Services to child survivors tended to be in similar proportions. However, the majority of services provided to adult survivors were crisis intervention and legal advocacy. Medical accompaniment and transportation services lagged far behind the top two service categories. State grantees saw a decline in general audience and youth presentations and participants, which was to be expected given the start of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Tribal grantees saw a decline at the start of the pandemic in general audience participants, but then a sudden rise. Analysis of this figure done at FVPSA has led us to conclude that this was due to a data input error by a grantee. Even though we are aware of the error and have contacted that grantee to correct it, until it is corrected in our system, it will show up in the overall program statistics that are reported. The total number of sub-awardees in 2020 and 2021 saw little change from the 2019 figures. However, total sub-awardee funding grew by 8% in 2020 and 5% in 2021. Average sub-awardee funding also grew by 6% in 2020 and 5% in 2021. When average sub-awardee funding is broken down by type, sub-awardees characterized as other have the highest average funding, followed by shelter sub-awardees and non-shelter sub-awardees. The top 10 culturally specific and underserved subrecipients have been consistent over the past 4 years. Hispanic subrecipients were the largest category of subrecipients reported by grantees. This was followed by those that served 2 or more categories, then Native American, then Asian and Pacific Islander, and then African American subrecipients. Immigrant, LGBTQ, age, disability-focused, and faith-based were the final 5. Please note that a subrecipient has to have a singular focus and not focus on 2 or more populations to be counted as a singular subrecipient. In 2020 and 2021, the number of states that did not report funding a culturally specific or underserved program increased for 2 consecutive years. However, this only indicates not reporting. It is possible that a state is funding such a program, but has not reported it yet. The overall breakdown of locations for subrecipients remained constant in 2020 and 2021, with rural ones making up 48% and 47% of programs, urban programs being 37% for both years, suburban being 12% for both years, and frontier being 4% for both years. In conclusion, the COVID-19 pandemic severely affected some of the typical usage patterns for services that survivors required. Tribal grantees were particularly affected by pandemic-related disruptions. However, despite these challenges, the number of survivors assisted during the first 2 years of the pandemic equaled 95% of the last recorded pre-pandemic years total for both years. Challenges in the reporting of data have affected what we will be reporting to Congress and other funding entities for evaluation, demonstrating the importance of making sure prompt and accurate PPRs are submitted.